Is reading digitally in Chinese better than on paper? What are the best digital tools for reading? And what should you do if you can't find texts that are both interesting and at the right level? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, I'm going to answer listener and reader questions about reading in Chinese. I do this in this episode because we have a reading challenge on for November. It starts on the 10th and lasts until the end of the month. These challenges are completely free to join and meant to encourage you to invest a little bit extra time into learning Chinese. And this month then the focus is on reading. If you want to join, head over to challenges.hackingchinese.com or check the link in the description. On Hacking Chinese, I have also published an article that contains a lot of reading recommendations and other useful tips and tricks. In this episode, I will discuss 3 questions that I've received about reading in Chinese, and if you have any questions about reading or anything else related to learning Chinese, feel free to send them to me or leave a comment on Hacking Chinese and I might address them in an upcoming episode. The 3 questions are about the best tools for digital reading, then a slightly more critical question about whether or not digital reading is actually all that good, and if something isn't lost when reading on a screen. And then the final question is about what to do if you cannot find texts to read that are both interesting and at the right level. The first question comes from Nora, and as I just said, it is about which digital tools I recommend for reading practice. Since the second question is also relevant here, let's have a look at that one too. This question comes from Simon, who has seen that many people recommend reading digitally, and indeed I do that as well. And he's worried that something is lost when reading on a screen, that there are certain skills that you don't practice, and that you should in fact read much more on paper than most students do. And he wants to know what I think about this. So both these questions are about digital reading, so let's start in the positive end and discuss which uses digital reading can have, which tools to use, and so on, and then we will switch to a more critical angle to see if digital reading can indeed be bad for you in certain situations. But let's start with the positive things, and I think some of you might not even think about these too much or realize how important they are, especially if you started learning after the advent of the smartphone. The first benefit is that reading becomes portable in a whole different way when you can read anything you want on your phone. Sure, it was perfectly possible to lug printed books around before that and read that way, or read on your computer or somewhere else, but having something that is always in your pocket is very useful. It gives you many more opportunities to read and learn, and this is something that shouldn't be scoffed at. It is indeed one of the main advantages of digital reading. This isn't limited to reading, of course. You can also listen to things wherever you are, and you can access your flashcards or look things up and so on. So the smartphone has changed a lot when it comes to learning Chinese, and it's almost only for the better. Naturally, there are some downsides. It's also easy to get distracted by other things, and having Chinese available doesn't help in itself. You actually have to engage with the Chinese for it to have a positive impact. Another huge advantage of digital reading is that you can look things up very easily. I've talked about this before on the podcast, but when I started learning Chinese, we used a textbook where certain passages only had Chinese characters, and we did not have access to digital dictionaries. Or at least the dictionaries that we had that were digital did not have handwriting input, so you still had to look up characters stroke by stroke. This was extremely time-consuming, and if you're using a printed dictionary, it is even more time-consuming. And the fact remains that you don't learn Chinese by trying to find the right page in a dictionary. Sure, you might learn other things by flipping pages and looking at actual Chinese in the dictionary, but the flipping of pages itself does not help. It is time wasted. With digital reading, you can just click on the word or tap it and you know what it means or how it is pronounced. You do not need to spend 3 minutes trying to find it. This makes learning much more efficient, and I would say it's one of the major benefits of digital reading in general. Finally, digital reading is great because you can search the texts that you have read or want to read. If you're trying to find a word or usage that you remember from something you've read, you can actually do that if you have a digital text, whereas if you have a printed book, this is almost impossible. There might be other benefits with digital reading, but I think those are the 3 major ones, at least for me. Nora wasn't asking about reading digitally in general though, she was asking specifically for which tools I recommend. This question is very hard to answer though, because it depends on what operating system you use. Are you on a smartphone? If so, is it an Android or iOS phone? Or if you're using your computer, what kind of computer is it? What browser do you use? And so on. I can still offer some guidance based on the general advantages of digital reading though, and I think that this will be helpful. So first things first, being able to look things up is the main advantage of digital reading, so you need some good way of doing that. If you're on a computer or browser, you can install a pop-up dictionary, and there are many of these, and I can't recommend a specific one. It depends on your browser, etc., etc. However, they mostly do the same thing. You hover or click with your mouse on Chinese characters, and their definition and readings will appear on screen. Then these tools vary exactly in what functions they have and so on, but just as long as you can look things up easily, that is more than enough. Next, I think you should get a good dictionary. And exactly what that means depends a little bit on what you're reading, but I would recommend using Pleco or Hanping, which are both excellent dictionaries for learners of Chinese. Both have free dictionaries, which are adequate for most students, but they also have professional dictionaries that might be useful for specific cases. For example, I've recommended Outlier Linguistics Dictionary of Chinese Characters before on the podcast, so getting that for Pleco if you want, and if you're interested in the origins of Chinese characters and how they work, is a great idea. While we're on the topic of Pleco, I also want to recommend the Document Reader, which essentially combines the pop-up dictionary with Pleco's own dictionaries. So you can paste or open a document on your phone, read it in Pleco, and then have access to Pleco definitions by tapping on characters. Super useful. Finally, I want to mention apps that recommend reading materials to you based on your interests and your level. Depending on what you prefer, you can check out apps like Do Chinese, The Chairman's Bao, and MyLingua. Okay, so now that we've talked about the upsides of digital reading, it's time to get to Simon's question, which is about potential downsides of digital reading. Is something lost when we read on screen all the time, and does it really teach us how to read Chinese properly? Well, as I just said, there are some major benefits with digital reading, and these can't just be dismissed. That means that I think that digital reading is, in general and on the whole, very positive. If you want to read a more carefully structured argument for this, you can check out David Moser's guest article on Hacking Chinese called The New Paperless Revolution in Chinese Reading. And while it isn't very new anymore, all the arguments are as valid as when the article was written. David started learning Chinese around the time I was born, so he has plenty of experience learning both with and without digital resources. That being said, digital reading certainly does have certain downsides. It could be, for example, that we get so reliant on this technology that we can't do without it, and then one day when we have to, we simply can't function. One might argue, for example, that learning to read with a pop-up dictionary is a bit like learning to bike with training wheels. The goal then is to learn to ride a bike without the training wheels, and the longer you keep them on, the slower you will learn. I don't think this is a good analogy for digital reading, however, because very few people aim to learn to bike only with training wheels on. That is not an acceptable final outcome. Reading is different though, because reading with a dictionary, if you're reading something quite difficult, technical, or just otherwise outside your comfort zone, is perfectly fine, while we also certainly want to be able to read without that dictionary. So in contrast with the training wheels, when it comes to reading, we actually want to be able to read both with a dictionary and without it. A better analogy might be to write things down in order to remember them. I think it should be abundantly clear that writing things down to remember them is necessary, indeed essential in modern society, but I think it should be equally clear that that doesn't mean we can stop remembering things without pen and paper. That is still a worthwhile thing to learn. Reading with and without digital tools is pretty close to this, I think. Yes, most of the time when you read, you will have access to digital tools, but that doesn't mean you should use them so much that you can't read without them. Something I haven't explained yet and just taken for granted is that there are certain things you won't learn if you have access to, say, a pop-up dictionary all the time when reading. Without that dictionary, you can't just instantly call up the meaning and reading of any character, and so you don't develop strategies for dealing with ambiguity or things you don't understand fully on the word level when reading. If you encounter an unknown word, it matters greatly how you deal with this, provided that you don't have access to a dictionary then. With practice, you can get better at dealing with unknown words, for example, by guessing their meaning based on what comes before, or maybe you keep reading and are able to fill in the blank afterwards as you learn more about the text and what happens later. Learning to use strategies like this take a lot of practice, and if you always have access to the meaning of any character just by tapping on it, you will never really try to figure out what something means without access to that dictionary. This is something I think most language teachers are well aware of, but that many students rarely think about. For example, we might be reading a text in class, and a student asks, "What does this word mean?" Instead of just giving the answer all the time, which is essentially what a pop-up dictionary does, it can be very helpful to stop there and see what the student can do on their own to build these strategies. For example, what words come immediately before the unknown word, and what do you think these say about this unknown word? What types of words fit here? What do you think that the word might mean based on the rest of the text we've read so far? And so on. It doesn't end there though, because if you keep reading, you can usually guess what a word means just based on what comes after it. So instead of stopping every time you encounter a word you don't know, look it up and then move on. You move on first and check, can I guess what that word means based on what comes after? And then you don't need to look it up. Many students are scared of this type of ambiguity, but it is a normal thing when you read and listen in a foreign language. In second language acquisition research, this is called tolerance of ambiguity and is generally linked to being good at listening and reading in a foreign language. This is probably because weaker readers and listeners get stuck on every single thing they don't know, and that obviously impacts their ability to understand. Activities like these also encourage you to focus intensely on the structure of the language of the things you do understand, so you can use what you can glean from that to guess what something new means. This is useful in and of itself, beyond the fact that it's crucial for reading without a dictionary. And as I said a while back, I don't think we're there yet when you can simply say that you will always have access to a digital dictionary when reading in Chinese. Maybe we'll get there in the future when we all have implants and head-up displays showing us what things we don't know mean, but we are not there yet, so I think it's great to read without a digital dictionary now and then. This does not mean that the benefits I mentioned with digital reading earlier are not important, it simply means that it's not the only thing you should be doing. Naturally, if you think that you'll be in contexts where you don't have access to digital tools, this becomes even more important. For example, if you want to pass a proficiency exam, they certainly won't allow you to use a dictionary on the exam. This brings us to the third question, which is not about digital tools, but still about reading. It comes from Jessica, who wants to know what she should do if she can't find texts that are both comprehensible and interesting. To put this question into context, I often say that reading and listening should be meaningful, that you're focusing on the message or the information, and that the Chinese is comprehensible to you. I often also stress the importance of motivation and enjoying what you're doing, and of course, if you're going to read a lot, that means that you need to read things that you enjoy. These two principles can come into conflict with each other, however. What if something you really want to read is too hard, so it wouldn't count as being comprehensible, and you might need to spend a lot of time, maybe with a digital dictionary, to make sense of it? Should you still read it? This is a question I've partially addressed in an article about authentic versus comprehensible content, and I'll put a link in the show notes, but in general, I think that motivation should be priority number one. If you are not motivated to read, you will read less, and if you don't enjoy learning Chinese, you might quit entirely. And then it doesn't really matter if this was slightly less efficient than reading something more comprehensible. So in that sense, I think the first goal should be to read more and make sure you find the things that you enjoy reading. However, for most students, there is a limit to how difficult something can be and still be enjoyable. While some students might be okay with reading a text that's so hard that it feels like deciphering a code and do that for hours and hours, most students are not willing to do that. It's also worthwhile to take into account why extensive reading is so good in the first place, namely that you're able to cover a lot of text. You can read long texts, and these are typically more interesting than short texts. It means you can get into the text and build some flow, which simply isn't possible if you have to use a dictionary every sentence. The main problem with difficult texts is that you spend way too much time on too few characters. I mean the total number of characters here, not the number of unique characters. So if you read for 1 hour, you might be able to cover 10 times as much text if it is relatively easy, compared to if this text is extremely challenging. This means that you will see all the words and characters 10 times as often in different contexts, and you will learn a lot more from that in general. So there isn't a clear answer here. On the one hand, motivation is all important. If you don't like reading, you will not read, and therefore you won't learn. So it goes without saying that you have to pick things you enjoy enough to actually read in Chinese. On the other hand, I think the case for extensive reading and generally focusing on comprehensible input is very strong, so do that as much as you can. And of course, for most students in most situations, these two might not be in conflict at all. You might be able to find things that you can make sense of and that are interesting to you. Maybe they are not the most interesting thing you can think about, but then again, you also have another motivation for reading these texts, which is to learn Chinese. This is a difficult balancing act, and at the end of the day, it depends on how boring you find the comprehensible texts to be, or indeed how interesting and engaging you find the very challenging texts to be. Also, nobody forces you to use only one approach, so when you find interesting content that is comprehensible, read that, and when you find something more challenging that you really want to read, you can read that as well. The more, the better. This brings us to the end of this episode. Don't forget to check the show notes for more information and inspiration about learning Chinese, and I hope to see you in the reading challenge. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.